The alumni show re-inspired my faith in myself. It reminded me of my high school days when I truly believed I could do anything. But this moment of euphoria quickly turned to ashes. As the glow of success faded, the experience of the show only highlighted the angst that had enveloped the rest of his life. He grew acutely despondent about his stalled career and his unhappy marriage, and the feelings almost overwhelmed him a few days later. Standing on a bridge over the Chicago River in the middle of a typically frigid winter, he looked out over the water and felt a desperate desire to recapture those warm feelings of high school life when he had been the esteemed leader of a gang, romance was in the air, and everything seemed possible. I stood on the bridge, and I felt as if my life was over. I had put away all my dreams from childhood, and I was miserable. But misery inspired decision as Hefner thought to himself, I've got to do something. Within weeks he moved to start his own magazine. He had toyed with the idea earlier, but now he threw himself into a project that would express all of his interests, ideas, and passions. Its centerpiece would be the subject that increasingly captured his imagination: sex. I just decided to do it all on my own. Nobody else, just do it, he said. He knew there was a market for photographs of nude women from his experience with Publishers Development Corporation, whose low-quality magazines still appealed. Esquire, he believed, had deteriorated by removing many of its pin-ups and cartoons. I thought I could really actually put together a good magazine. I felt with absolute certainty that I knew exactly what I was doing. Hefner began talking up the idea with close friends. He and Eldon Sellers had taken to playing ping-pong in the basement of his apartment building, and amid the games Hefner began discussing his plans for a magazine. He had it all figured out, and the way he explained it, I got very excited and wanted to be a part of it, Sellers explained. Hefner also contacted Bert Zolo, his accomplice from Esquire, who was now working for a public relations firm, and laid out his plan. I'd like to produce an entertainment magazine for the city-bred guy, breezy, sophisticated. The girly features would guarantee the initial sale, but the magazine would have quality, too. Give the reader reprint stories by big-name writers, top art by local artists, cartoons, humor, maybe some pages in full color to really give it a classy look. Later, with some money in the bank, we'll begin increasing the quality, reducing the girly features, going after advertising, and really making it an Esquire-type magazine. In the spring of 1953, Hefner took concrete steps to bring his fantasy to life. He spent his evenings at a card table in the living room of his South Side apartment, laboring into the early morning hours as he blocked out the elements of the magazine he decided to call Stag Party. He formed HMH Publishing Company and enlisted Eldon Sellers to raise funds. Meanwhile, he contacted distributors all over the country whom he had come to know from his days with Publishers Development Corporation and solicited advance orders for the new magazine. His letter announced, "A deal that should make some money for both of us. Stag Party, a brand new magazine for men, will be out this fall. Every issue of the magazine, he promised, will have a beautiful, full-page, male-pleasing nude study in full, natural color. Now you know what I mean when I say this is going to be one of the best sellers you've ever handled." Thrilled with his new endeavor, Hefner threw himself into the work. He sat for long hours at the card table pounding out copy for the magazine, combing through available articles and cartoons, and sorting the orders from wholesalers that were arriving steadily. He didn't really sleep much because he was working practically all night, Millie reported. Hefner's enthusiasm became contagious. Bert Zolo, who had expressed reservations initially, was won over and described Hefner as a highly creative guy who was nevertheless highly realistic. He would be successful. Much effort went into raising money with family and friends. A wealthy girlfriend of Sellers's invested $2,000, and Hefner borrowed $200 from a local bank and hawked his furniture with a loan company for $600 more. Zolo invested $300, while Keith Hefner contributed $1,000 to his brother's venture. Grace Hefner, even though she had reservations about the magazine, invested another $1,000. A grateful Hugh wrote to his mother, "Because of the spontaneity of it, and because it was made with the knowledge that much of the magazine, like my book, will not be material that you fully, personally approve of, This is just about the nicest thing you have ever done for me." Eventually, Hefner gathered just over $8,000 to put out the first issue of the magazine. Meanwhile, enough orders had come in from distributors for Hefner to make an arrangement with a printer he knew in New Rochelle, Illinois. With a new press and some open time, the man agreed to print Stag Party on credit, with half down in 30 days and the other half in 60 days. Hefner also made an important decision to hire an art director to handle the visual side of his new magazine. He contacted a Chicago graphic artist named Art Paul about illustrating a story, but was so taken by the illustrations on display that he pressed him to assume a larger role. Hefner had arrived at the artist's studio with a growth of beard, wrinkled clothes, and a harried look, but enthusiasm for the new magazine bubbled out of him. "I thought, for God's sakes, he's either got to be an exceptional person or he's got to be crazy," Paul recalled. But the artist agreed to work part-time on the magazine's visuals, and Hefner paid part of his fee in cash and part in stock from the new company. Hefner made his most crucial move, however, when he purchased the rights to a nude photograph of perhaps the hottest, sexiest young actress in Hollywood. Marilyn Monroe had rocketed to movie stardom in 1952 on the basis of the movies The Asphalt Jungle, All About Eve, and Niagara. In the subsequent flurry of publicity, it came to light that a Los Angeles photographer had shot several nude photos of her in 1949 for use in a calendar. Monroe joked that during the shoot she had nothing on but the radio. Hefner read that the John Baumgarth Calendar Company of Chicago now owned the rights to one of the photos, but was reluctant to send its calendar through the mail because of the post office taboo on nudity. Knowing that he needed a gimmick to sell the first issue of his magazine, Hefner quickly drove to the company. He persuaded John Baumgarth to sell him the rights to the photos, which featured the actress sitting seductively against a red velvet backdrop. As the magazine moved nearer to publication, however, an unexpected crisis loomed. In September 1953, Hefner received a letter from a law firm representing Stag magazine. This publication considered Stag Party to be an infringement on its title and threatened to sue. Hefner convened a frantic meeting with Millie and Eldon Sellers, and they began tossing around other titles: Top Hat, Bachelor, Gentleman, Sir, Satyrs, Pan. But none seemed suitable, and Sellers finally offered Playboy. Millie thought it sounded outdated and made people think of the 1920s, but Hugh, who associated the Roaring Twenties with high living, parties, wine, women, and song, the things we want the magazine to mean, loved the name and adopted it immediately. A logo had already been completed by the cartoonist Arv Miller, a stag bedecked in smoking jacket, standing against a fireplace with a cigarette holder and martini glass, and it required a quick substitution of a rabbit head. A bit later, Art Paul would create the famous rabbit head silhouette logo with its elegant, on-the-town look. In November 1953, everything was set to launch the first issue of Playboy. Advance orders for 70,000 copies had rolled in over the past several months, but no one knew if the magazine would really sell. The first issue rolled off the presses without a publication date because its youthful editor and publisher, while convinced he had an attractive product, remained uncertain whether sales would support a second issue. Hugh Hefner had gambled everything on the venture, both materially and emotionally, and now he could only wait and see how it would play out. Part 2. Ascent. Chapter 4. How to Win Friends and Titillate People. In the first week of November 1953, a nervous Hugh Hefner walked the streets of downtown Chicago, haunting the newsstands for a glimpse of his new magazine. The first issue of Playboy had just appeared, and like an anxious father he fretted about the status of his offspring. A few weeks earlier, Hefner had negotiated a good deal with a distributor, Empire News, based on advance orders for the magazine. Then, in mid-October, he had driven the 75 miles to Rochelle Printing in his beat-up 1941 Chevy, along with Eldon Sellers and Art Paul, and spent several hours copy-reading the page proofs. When the presses delivered the final product, and it was covered and bound, Hefner felt a surge of emotion. He described it as one of the greatest moments of my life. Now Hefner watched as browsers picked up a newsstand copy of Playboy, curiously looking at the table of contents before sneaking a peek at the Marilyn Monroe pictorial. He thrilled when a customer bought a copy, and his heart sank when they set it down and moved on. When the newsstand proprietors were not looking, Hefner even walked over and moved Playboy to a more prominent position in the display. Over a period of several days, he brooded that if his magazine did not sell, the prospect of shattered dreams and bankruptcy loomed in the near future. Hefner need not have worried. Within a short time, landslide sales made the new product a winner. Experts had predicted sales of about 60% of copies published, a respectable result. But Playboy sold nearly 80%, about 54,000 copies, an astounding figure for a new publication that had been launched on a minuscule budget with little publicity or advertising. The second issue, which already had been blocked out when the first appeared, hit the newsstands in early December, and a more confident Hefner now included his name on the masthead. The second issue outsold the first by about 2,000 copies. Even Hefner seemed a bit taken back by the powerful response to Playboy. The magazine appeared to strike a nerve almost immediately as not only readers, but American culture, or at least much of its male portion, seemed ready for it. The magazine's appeal radiated from its very first issue. Daring, provocative, even naughty, but not dangerous or subversive, Playboy expressed many of the mainstream values of post-war America while giving them an invigorating new form. Aimed at men who were trying to navigate the unfamiliar waters of a prosperous new social and economic milieu, the magazine offered an exciting vision of the good life for a society that, without totally being aware of the fact, was yearning to lead it. Playboy began bringing a submerged collective social fantasy to the surface. 1. While proud of his new publication, Hefner knew that it was far from what he envisioned in terms of quality and style. The first Playboy was lively and vibrant, crudely composed, and not very sophisticated-looking. The editor joked that its cobbled-together format consisted of something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. Behind the rough edges, however, lay all of the basic components that the magazine would refine and expand upon in the future. As Art Paul observed, the inaugural issue was a sketchbook for what the magazine was really going to be. A smiling, waving Marilyn Monroe sat on the cover along with a promise that the reader would find within, for the first time in any magazine, full color, the famous nude photo of the actress. Readers then encountered a jaunty introduction that announced a new kind of magazine for a new kind of male reader. If you're a man between the ages of 18 and 80, Playboy is meant for you. If you like your entertainment served up with humor, sophistication, and spice, Playboy will become a very special favorite. We want to make clear from the very start, we aren't a family magazine. If you're somebody's sister, wife, or mother-in-law and picked us up by mistake, please pass us along to the man in your life and get back to your ladies' home companion. Most of today's magazines for men spend all their time out of doors, thrashing through thorny thickets or splashing about in fast-flowing streams. We'll be out there too, occasionally. But we don't mind telling you in advance, we plan on spending most of our time inside. We like our apartment. We enjoy mixing up cocktails and an hors d'oeuvre or two, putting a little mood music on the phonograph, and inviting in a female acquaintance for a quiet discussion on Picasso, Nietzsche, jazz, sex. Affairs of state will be out of our province. We don't expect to solve any world problems or prove any great moral truths. If we are able to give the American male a few extra laughs and a little diversion from the anxieties of the atomic age, we'll feel we've justified our existence. There it was in a nutshell. The promise of sophisticated amusement for young urban males who sought relief from the stresses and strains of workaday life, and who felt more comfortable, or perhaps more accurately, wanted to feel more comfortable, pursuing modern art, films, and foreign cuisines rather than wily trout, smoky campfires, and recalcitrant do-it-yourself projects. The magazine would be, in Hefner's memorable phrase, a pleasure primer styled to the masculine taste. A quick scan of the first issue's contents elaborated the nature of the young Chicagoan's magazine. Sexual titillation pervaded. One article explained how to enliven a boring party with a provocative game, strip quiz, while another depicted nude swimming festivities in California. A selection from the Decameron provided a humorous tale of adultery. Ribald themes dominated the many cartoons. One showed a shapely young woman about to write in her diary asking a friend, "What is the past tense of virgin?" as well as Playboy's party jokes. Other articles explored the return of the all-purpose back, the Dorsey brothers, and desk design for the modern office. The men's shop displayed the latest in consumer amenities for young men, while Matanzas Love Affair explained the delights of Cuban food and drink. Reprints of stories by Arthur Conan Doyle and Ambrose Bierce offered mystery and adventure. Miss Gold Digger of 1953 denounced greedy women who manipulated the legal system for alimony. The centerpiece of Playboy's first issue, however, was its Sweetheart of the Month. As promised on the cover, it showcased the sensual attractions of Marilyn Monroe. "She's as famous as Dwight Eisenhower and Dick Tracy, and she and Dr. Kinsey have monopolized sex this year," said the text. "She is natural sex personified. It is there in every look and movement. That's what makes her the most natural choice in the world for our very first Playboy sweetheart." Several photos of Monroe, including a nude shot of her posed against red velvet, provided proof for the assertion. The magazine assured readers, "We'll be running a beautiful, full-color, unpinned pin-up in each new issue of Playboy." What drew men to this potpourri of offerings? The attractive bundling of sexual images, of course, highlighted by the Monroe pictorial, initially hooked a male audience whose previous encounters with erotic material likely consisted of grimy, grainy photos in underground venues. But Playboy's appeal was rooted more deeply in the broad social and cultural milieu of post-war America. Middle-class life in the 1950s had emerged from the cauldron of the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II in the 1940s. Traumatic events that had devastated the economic institutions of the country in the first case and dislocated it socially and psychologically in the second. Memories of bankruptcies and lost mortgages, of battlefield scars and aching separations lingered painfully in the American psyche. Millions of ordinary citizens had entered the post-war period yearning to replace uncertainty with security, volatility with stability, need with possession. The United States' victorious position in the world, what pundits increasingly described as the American century, provided the means to do so. Coming out of World War II as an economic colossus, the United States had changed direction from a military to a consumer agenda. By the 1950s, prosperity had become the hallmark of American life. Middle-class citizens enjoyed an economy of abundance that brought an unprecedented flow of goods. Supported by the mortgage provision of the GI Bill, a vast new army of homeowners prompted a boom in housing construction that produced swelling suburbs such as Levittown, Long Island, that built and sold 17,000 homes beginning in 1949. The automobile industry boomed as Detroit companies, led by General Motors, produced ever larger, more stylish, and more powerful cars for average income buyers. High employment and steady growth in income encouraged leisure activity with a resulting boom in vacation travel and television sales. The flood of consumer products to the middle class led Fortune magazine to proclaim in 1956, "Never has a whole people spent so much money on so many things in such an easy way as Americans are doing today." The historian David Potter, in a much-discussed book titled People of Plenty, 1954, concluded that material abundance, the key factor in American development over 2 centuries, had reached an apex in the post-war era. In a special 1959 double issue titled The Good Life, Life magazine marveled that in modern America, suddenly what used to be the small leisured classes became the big leisured masses. The American family emerged at the center of this new consumer economy. Riding the crest of the ballyhooed baby boom of the late 1940s and early 1950s, it achieved newfound prominence in the post-war period. A new cultural code of family togetherness idealized life in suburban ranch houses, cruising about in station wagons, and gathering in family rooms to watch television shows such as Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. Americans embraced the promise of a new kind of family experience that, in the words of one historian, would fulfill virtually all its members' personal needs through an energized and expressive personal life. This environment of material abundance and family togetherness forced a reshaping of the basic American tenet of individualism. Earlier periods had stressed a rugged personal code where the citizen had marshaled hard work, determination, and self-control to blaze his own path to success. But in the heady days of the post-war era, a new socio-economic atmosphere demanded revisions. An economy increasingly dominated by large corporations made bureaucracy, not entrepreneurship, the new field of play. Here, a personality composed of attractive images and compelling personal skills, not an old-fashioned character of rigid moral values, would foster teamwork and ascent up the corporate ladder. New avatars of success, such as the clergyman-therapist Norman Vincent Peale, in his wildly popular The Power of Positive Thinking, urged readers to call upon a higher power to gain confidence and strengthen mental health as the basis for securing happiness and prosperity. The pressures of the Cold War molded these elements of abundance, family, and teamwork into a compelling American way of life. Economically, government defense contracts underwrote a significant portion of 1950s prosperity. Rhetorically, the United States trumpeted a creed of anti-communism that juxtaposed American bounty and family, bureaucratic efficiency and vibrant personality against drab Stalinist collectivism. Pressures for conformity emerging from corporate bureaucracies, national advertising campaigns, and the suburban ethos gained additional power from an anti-communist ideology that demanded solidarity against the Red Menace. In 1959, Life ran a light-hearted story, complete with several photos, about newlyweds who spent their week-long honeymoon in a bomb shelter, surrounded by a cornucopia of consumer amenities. But as the 1950s unfolded, challenges arose to this American way of life that showed widening cracks in its imposing edifice. Much of it was covert. By mid-decade, Elvis Presley and rock and roll music were shaking middle-class restraint with depth charges of sexuality and emotional rebellion. The Beats, through novelists such as Jack Kerouac and poets such as Allen Ginsberg, bitterly criticized middle-class materialism and created a bohemian counterculture devoted to unfettered personal expression. Critics attacked the conformity and unimaginative quality of bourgeois America in works such as William H. White's The Organization Man, 1956, David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd, 1950, and Dwight MacDonald's A Theory of Mass Culture, 1957. MacDonald's words typified the critique. There is slowly emerging a tepid, flaccid, middle-brow culture that threatens to engulf everything in its spreading ooze. In the heart of the Eisenhower era, it was the genius of Playboy and its editor to articulate an approach that tapped both mainstream aspirations and marginal unhappiness. While rebellious, Hefner's magazine did not challenge the basic tenets of post-war American life. Instead, it channeled the restlessness of ambitious, irreverent, often accomplished young men toward eliminating its stodgier features and loosening its most restrictive demands. It expressed a dissent based on lifestyle. Playboy and its readers sought to make hard play the equal of hard work in the American creed. They sought to remove barriers of pleasure in order to enjoy the full bounty of the new American wealth. Through this shared fantasy of self-gratification, they aimed to enhance the American dream of an abundant life, not overthrow it. Thus, Playboy, while scandalizing old-fashioned defenders of religion and morality, appealed to growing numbers of people intoxicated with abundance and eager to throw off restraints. Hefner had a partial awareness of his magazine's cultural role. "I wanted to create a breezy, class entertainment magazine for the city-bred guy," he explained in early 1954. At the same time, he believed that his desires were shared by others. The whole focus of the magazine was the notion of living unmarried in a city with your own apartment, with a nice car, with good food and drink, where you'd actually prepare something for a romantic dinner. It was all in the first issue. Indeed, this cultural agenda for the good life proved to be a bond between Hefner's magazine and its readers. 2. Looking back from a vantage point many years later, Hugh Hefner saw his magazine standing at the ramparts, battling against 1950s conformity and repression. Before Playboy, the only moral, proper way for a middle-class person to live their life was to get married, settle down, have babies, and live happily ever after, whatever that meant, he explained. We dared to suggest that there were other ways of living your life. He believed that a pernicious alliance of religion and politics had created a censorious public morality and a rigid creed of family virtue in the post-war period. He also blamed red-hunting McCarthyism for making a mockery of World War II's democratic aims and turning anti-communism into a recipe for political and social repression. Playboy, Hefner concluded, struck a blow for cultural freedom by promoting a freer expression of eroticism. We knew that we were obviously ringing some kind of a revolutionary bell by simply running nude pictures in the magazine, he noted. But Playboy played a more complex, even ambiguous role as it went out to the American public in the mid-1950s. Its dissenting impulses, while real, were hardly revolutionary. In many ways, perhaps even more powerfully, it affirmed post-war American values. Seeking to loosen the system from within rather than assault it from without, Hefner served as an agent of regeneration for the American way of life. Playboy is dedicated to the enjoyment of the good life that is every American's heritage, if he's willing to display a little of the initiative and daring-do that made the country great in the first place. Instead of settling for job security, conformity, togetherness, anonymity, and slow death, he told Cold War America. And just incidentally, while trying to climb that ladder of success through creativity, thought, initiative, and daring to be different, Americans supply the only chance this country has of moving back into a position of world leadership. In various ways, Playboy consistently articulated a goal of individual success and social prosperity. The magazine urged its readers to enjoy life by embracing leisure, entertainment, and material comforts. Playboy encouraged people to partake of exciting new opportunities instead of delaying gratification. Our readers believe in the good life, and so do we, it told aspiring authors in 1954. Hence, freelancers will make us happy by submitting material that stresses wine, women, and song rather than rod, reel, and bait bucket. Editorial asides in the magazine assured readers that the good life consisted of good food and drink, first-rate reading matter, and a compliable young person of feminine gender. Playboy repeatedly connected its vision of pleasure pursuits to upward mobility in 1950s America. On its first anniversary, it reported that the average Playboy reader has a little better education, position, and income than his non-Playboy reading brother. The following year, the magazine ran a piece in Advertising Age that quoted a composite Playboy reader. "Don't get me wrong, I'm a hard-working guy and I'm well on my way to the top in business. But I like to have fun. I like nice clothes, great food and drink, women. No, I'm only 29. I'm college-educated. I earn a good living, and I expect to earn a good deal more. I have faith in myself and the future. I'm not worried about tomorrow. I'm living now." A 1955 survey of Playboy readers uncovered statistical evidence supporting its appeal to the youthful, ambitious, and affluent. Conducted by the market research company of Gould, Gleiss, and Ben Incorporated, it reported that the great majority of readers were between the ages of 20 and 34. Over 70% had attended college. Almost 63% were business and professional men or students studying to enter those fields. 88% owned automobiles, and nearly all took regular vacations. Most pursued hobbies such as photography, reading, or music, smoked a wide variety of tobacco products, and consumed various brands of hard liquor and beer. Its average reader, the magazine concluded, was a young man about town who enjoys good, gracious living. Playboy's argument that social success and a hunger for the good life went hand in hand found its clearest expression, however, in a 1956 ad campaign that asked, "What is a Playboy? Is he simply a wastrel, a ne'er-do-well, a fashionable bum? Far from it. He can be a sharp-minded young business executive, a worker in the arts, a university professor, an architect or engineer. He can be many things, providing he possesses a certain point of view. He must see life not as a vale of tears, but as a happy time. He must take joy in his work, without regarding it as the end and all of living. He must be an alert man, an aware man, a man of taste, a man sensitive to pleasure, a man who, without acquiring the stigma of the voluptuary or the dilettante, can live life to the hilt. The Playboy reader, in other words, was someone who was determined both to find economic success and enjoy its material and emotional fruits. But Hefner also grasped the more subtle point that Playboy embodied social fantasy as much as reality. While his magazine affirmed the appetites of well-connected stock traders, shrewd young lawyers, and au courant architects, it also provided a kind of wish fulfillment for weary salesmen or aspiring young middle managers who desperately wanted to believe they were on the fast track. As Hefner admitted in a 1955 interview, Playboy, in a sense, was an escapist magazine, projecting the kind of life part of the reader would like to live. It offered him an imaginary escape into the world of wine, women, and song, he said. Then the other part of him says he has to go back to his family responsibilities and his work. Central to Playboy's fantasy of the good life, of course, was a loosening of traditional restrictions on sexuality. Early issues of the magazine suggested that sex was a healthy, natural human impulse, not a dirty endeavor to be repressed or a sacred one to be elevated. An array of erotic photographs, pictorials, cartoons, jokes, and articles drove home the message. Nudity in the foreign film, for instance, with text and photographs, contrasted American and European movies in terms of depicting nudity. The movie censors of America have considered the human body and concluded that it is immoral, the magazine declared. But no one was justified in forcing its opinions, tastes, and attitudes on the rest of us. We make a habit of thumbing our noses at censors because we feel they have no place in a democracy. Hefner defended Playboy's sexual thrust. It's one of the things our guy is interested in, and there's no reason for us to apologize for it, he told an interviewer in 1955. He scorned the notion that his magazine's sexuality might corrupt the nation's youth. The idea that one must bring our literature and entertainment down to the level of 12-year-olds is incredible, he argued. Healthy sex was part of the good life, Hefner insisted, and Playboy's expression of that sentiment reached the young city man in a way that makes him feel a real identification with the magazine. The first issues of Playboy also called for male liberation from the demands of marriage and family life. Preaching the gospel of bachelorhood, the magazine offered articles such as Miss Gold Digger of 1953, which warned that greedy women, backed by the courts, were using divorce settlements to stick an ex-spouse for a healthy chunk of his earnings from that day forward for the rest of his unnatural life. When an irate woman sent a letter complaining that most men were unscrupulous seducers who ought to pay and pay and pay when fleeing a marriage, Playboy replied, shut up." Open Season on Bachelors examined marriage traps laid by women for unsuspecting men, while A Vote for Polygamy came to the breezy conclusion that the end of the ignoble experiment in monogamy may be near. Hefner and his early readers, resisting the powerful pull of family ideology of the 1950s, fantasized sex as a form of play released from its ties to marriage and procreation. Beyond sex, Playboy advocated a wide variety of leisure activities to enhance the good life. Smart, flattering clothing became a must in articles such as That Brooks Brothers Look, which proclaimed, "Burn my zoot suit, mother. Conservative Eastern dress is a must this season." Elegant cuisine became another necessity as the magazine took on a food and drink editor in early 1954, Thomas Mario, who expounded upon the pleasures of the oyster and explained the manly art of outdoor cooking to aspiring male sophisticates. Sex, of course, was never far from the flame. In Mario's words, when you deliver the thick browned steaks, charred and crisp on the outside, rare inside, and then hand her an ear of roasted golden bantam corn on the cob, you detect in her eyes a kind of yielding rapture. Are any further stratagems necessary? Playboy supplied a steady diet of entertainment. It offered sketches of celebrities such as Orson Welles, Steve Allen, and Frank Lloyd Wright, while brief tours of music recordings, films, books, and sports kept readers conversant with the latest turns in popular culture. The renowned musician Dave Brubeck explained the new jazz audience. Playboy After Hours began in 1955 with reviews of restaurants in Chicago and New York. The new British musical The Boyfriend, records by Mabel Mercer, Frank Sinatra, and Billie Holiday, the movies Mr. Roberts and Pete Kelly's Blues, and books by Harold Robbins and George Axelrod. The annual college issue surveyed the male student with his dreams of the future bachelor apartment, the hi-fi set, the well-stocked liquor cabinet, the sports car, and the bedroom-eyed beauties who will help him enjoy it all. These are the dreams, of course, that Playboy is made of. This process of pleasure priming saw Playboy preparing readers to face the challenges of upward mobility. Shepard Mead, in How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, deployed satire to mask shrewd advice on how to thrive in the corporate world. As he explained, it's the ability to get along, to make decisions, and to get contacts that will drive you ahead. Be an all-around man of no special ability, and you will rise to the top. For the aspiring gourmand, articles explained a long list of common menu terms found in restaurants with a continental background. Essays such as Evelyn Waugh's The Death of Painting assessed the impact of photography and abstract expressionism on modern art. Playboy's fictional offerings tried to sharpen readers' appreciation of the finer things in life. Top writers responded to generous payments, and the magazine began publishing short stories by distinguished writers such as Ray Bradbury, W. Somerset Maugham, Charles Beaumont, John Steinbeck, and James Jones. Some offered gems, such as Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, a chilling futuristic tale, and Beaumont's Black Country, a gripping story about a jazz horn player. But others did not hand over their best material. That was fine with Playboy. Indeed, a solicitation in Writer's Digest revealed the type of writing sought by the magazine. Fiction should be modern, aware, sophisticated, highly literate, but not literary. Articles should treat subjects of interest to the city-bred operator who knows his way around, and should be handled in a breezy, comfortable, unpedantic style. Humor should be ribald and/or satirical, and sex, being a part of the good life, will have an important place in all three categories. In other words, the cultural curriculum taught at the Playboy Schoolhouse aimed to provide a veneer of sophistication rather than the real thing. Compiling a cultural Cliff's Notes for those who had earned gentlemen's C's in college, or for many others who had only dreamed of enrolling, the magazine tossed them aesthetic tidbits that were challenging, but not too challenging. Thus Hefner and Playboy defined the central obstacles facing 1950s America as matters of lifestyle and taste. He did not stand alone. As the historian Jackson Lears has pointed out, most highbrow cultural critics in this period also focused on aesthetics, making their critiques of American life a matter of taste, as they excoriated the bland conformity and tasteless consumption that had swallowed up the middle class. But instead of elitist chastisement, Hefner utilized can-do Midwestern uplift, mixing 2 parts eroticism to 1 part intellect, and adding a dash of irreverent humor. He cheerfully concocted a cultural cocktail that eased ambitious young men into a fuller enjoyment of American abundance in all of its material and emotional dimensions. 3. The attraction of Hugh Hefner's roadmap to the good life became evident in Playboy's sales. The print run, 70,000 copies for the first issue, grew steadily, and after 1 year stood at 185,000. It exploded to 500,000 by the end of 1955, and at 1.1 million copies a month passed Esquire by the end of 1956, with gross sales of some $3.5 million and a net profit before taxes of around $400,000. These quick quantum leaps in readership made the magazine an unprecedented success in American publishing history. Hefner was elated, as he wrote a couple of months after the magazine's first issue. "What do you say when a dream comes true? I own a magazine of my very own. Certainly much of my life, and especially the last 3 or 4 years, has been a preparation for this. For there is nothing on earth I would rather be doing than editing and publishing this magazine called Playboy. Perhaps I'll wake up in a few months and it will all be gone, but in this January of 1954, life is just a little more wonderful than I ever really believed it could be." But Hefner did not rest on his laurels. Playboy's initial success drove the young editor to work at an even more frenzied pace. Hef's reaction to the first issue? Going full blast, recalled Eldon Sellers. He worked nearly around the clock and barely saw his wife and daughter. Hefner wrote, "Playboy consumes 7 days of every week, more than a dozen hours a day, and I knock off at 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning." His personal identification with Playboy became almost total. "I've always edited the magazine for myself, on the assumption that my tastes are pretty much like those of our readers. The concept of the magazine should grow and broaden with me," he informed a local reporter. The growing profits were gratifying, but his real pleasure came from editing and publishing the magazine. It was a labor of love that reflected, in his words, a yearning to communicate, to express one's talents and ideas. Moreover, Hefner began formulating plans for expansion, opening Playboy to advertising, publishing a compilation book, The Best from Playboy, and licensing specialty items like calendars and cards. Impressive sales also brought institutional expansion. Hefner had prepared the first 3 issues of Playboy on his apartment card table, but in early 1954 accumulating profits allowed him to rent office space in a 4-story townhouse at 11 East Superior Street, on the near north side, directly across from Holy Name Cathedral. Hefner was delighted with this location in the bohemian section of Chicago that mingled office buildings, boutiques, antique stores, apartments, and a teeming nightlife of saloons, strip joints, and clubs. Playboy began with 1 floor of offices, but expansion led to the acquisition of all 4 floors in little more than a year. The magazine's profits also rescued the young editor and his family from debt. Sales from the first couple of issues permitted them to get their furniture out of hock, and Hefner bought a new Studebaker for his family on Christmas 1953. In mid-1955, he had the money to purchase a new Cadillac Eldorado for himself. He and Millie also prepared to move into a large, comfortable lakeshore apartment. When dreaming of his own magazine, he wrote, "I didn't realize that it would make me rich, but that's what it's doing." Even more importantly, however, Playboy's skyrocketing popularity put the young editor in the public eye. He became a celebrity, first in his hometown, then gradually throughout the rest of the country. He emerged as a subject of discussion and speculation. His angular features usually have a solemn, almost haggard look, though occasionally they break into a whimsical grin, described a feature article in Chicago Magazine. He speaks rapidly and evenly, punctuating a robust dictionary vocabulary with contemporary slang. Brief pieces on Hefner and Playboy appeared in Time and Newsweek by mid-1956, and the editor appeared as a guest on Mike Wallace's Night Beat, a popular New York television show. He became an American success story in the best Horatio Alger tradition. As he told a reporter, "From the time I left high school until the magazine succeeded, I was never a very happy guy. Now it's something like being in high school all over again, but on a much greater scale." Hefner's newfound success also inspired a surge of controversy. As Playboy began attracting attention, censorship problems arose. In October 1954, the magazine applied for a permanent second-class mailing permit. It had been operating with a temporary one up to this point, typically issued to periodicals. The U.S. Post Office delayed and then denied the application on the pretext that Playboy, which had skipped an issue because of production problems, was not regularly published. Then a reapplication was denied, this time on the grounds of obscenity. Postmaster General Arthur Summerfield informed Hefner that a revision of the magazine's contents might gain approval, so HMH Publishing brought a civil action against Summerfield in federal court in the District of Columbia in November 1955. Hefner sought an injunction to keep the post office from interfering with the delivery of his magazine and asked the court to enjoin the granting of a second-class permit. He challenged the censorship powers claimed by the post office and presented a ringing declaration of principle. "We don't think Postmaster Summerfield has any business editing magazines. We think he should stick to delivering the mail," Hefner proclaimed indignantly. "This isn't a new fight. It never is. Yesterday it was Anthony Comstock, today it is Arthur Summerfield." Hefner won a complete legal victory. The court issued an injunction restraining the post office from interfering with the magazine's distribution and ordered it to grant second-class privileges. Eventually, The court awarded Playboy $100,000 in compensation. A couple of months later, a ruckus arose when Chicago's Northwestern University banned Playboy from its bookstore. It claimed that protests had come in from English professors, a Navy ROTC officer, a women's service group, an assistant football coach, and a fraternity house mother. Upon investigating these letters of complaint, however, the Daily Northwestern, the student newspaper, discovered that the writers were fictitious. Meanwhile, Hefner wrote a letter to the university objecting to the ban. Censorship was particularly disturbing in a large university dedicated to the principles of democracy and freedom of speech and press, he wrote. Of course, these would-be censors may feel that college students aren't yet capable of choosing what to read or see or listen to. These same censors might next logically lead a raid on the Northwestern University library, which undoubtedly includes a great many books not quite suited to the adolescent mind. With both controversy and success swirling around Playboy, Hugh Hefner emerged as a cultural bellwether in post-war America. Playboy's agenda of sensual and material enjoyment reflected the nation's massive, ongoing shift from a work culture to a leisure culture. In a climate of unprecedented and widespread abundance, fresh desires for play were surmounting traditional demands for labor. Burdened too long by the deprivations of economic depression and the sacrifices of war, growing numbers of young Americans wanted to have fun and enjoy the good life. A restless young Midwesterner appreciated those desires. Indeed, he shared them and created a venue for their expression. Over the last half of the 1950s, his magazine would go on to create a full-blown fantasy formula designed to fulfill them. Playboy's rapid success, however, quickly overwhelmed its crude bureaucratic structure. Within months of the first issue, it became evident that a single editor and a few assistants, no matter how dedicated, would not suffice. With typical energy, Hefner threw himself into building a larger operation. Chapter 5. Hedonism Incorporated. As Playboy took off in its first year of publication, Hugh Hefner faced a happy problem. He was overwhelmed with work. The explosion of sales created editorial and production tasks that Hefner and a few part-time assistants could not handle. The young editor moved to address that need by hiring several individuals: editors, artists, photographers, promotions experts, businessmen, support staff, to flesh out the publication team. This influx brought a number of forceful, talented people to Hefner's side and made his operation a beehive of creative ferment. Expansion came in two stages. First, in 1954, the nucleus of the Playboy operation took shape with the arrival of a tiny group of long-time editorial operatives. Then, in 1956, came a second, larger wave of hiring that included a group of staffers who would reshape further the basic structure and look of the magazine. Throughout this growth process, Hefner put his creative stamp on nearly everything in Playboy. By the late 1950s, the young publisher had created an organizational structure that became the foundation for the magazine for decades. 1. The early days of Playboy, like those of any successful new venture, were marked by a great sense of excitement and anticipation. As sales of the first few issues of the magazine rose steadily, Hefner put together the skeleton of a publication staff throughout 1954 and early 1955. Art Paul came on board as a full-time art director, Ray Russell became associate editor, and Vince Tajiri took over as head of the photo department. Joe Pacek assumed the duties of paste and layout man. Marjorie Pittner became an all-purpose receptionist, subscription manager, and bookkeeper, while Eldon Sellers took on the tasks of advertising, circulation, and business manager. Pat Papangelis was hired as Hefner's secretary, and John Mastro joined the organization as production manager. The tiny group was energized by a powerful feeling of creating something fresh and interesting. Working in the small Superior Street townhouse in an atmosphere marked by common purpose and camaraderie, they felt a sense of mission. In those early days, it was really a team effort. We were all in on the creation of something exciting and important, Pittner reported. We were there because we loved what we were doing. With such a small and close-knit staff working in tight quarters at the brownstone on Superior Street, there was little division of labor. Recalled Pittner, "In those days I handled everything from tracking artwork and editorial material back and forth to the typesetter and the printer, to depositing checks from subscribers and labeling their copies for mailing. She also typed manuscripts for the magazine and even lent a hand to choosing risque jokes for the Party Jokes page, until Hefner raised an eyebrow at her awful choices and took her off the job." During Playboy's first Christmas, the entire group gathered to stuff magazines into envelopes, affix labels, and rush them out to mailboxes to get to subscribers on time while listening to Frank Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours album. A sense of closeness marked the office atmosphere. According to John Mastro, "We were a family together. We all knew what the job was, we had a common goal, and we all knew that if this thing goes, it was good for all of us." When Hefner got his first Cadillac, the whole staff gathered to congratulate him, while he personally handed out bonus checks and thanked them for their hard work at the office Christmas party. An early staffer observed, "There was a closeness there, and I guess a lot of it was just because of the fact that we were involved in a new adventure." Amid this warm atmosphere, several individuals emerged to play particularly important creative roles in shaping different parts of the magazine. When Art Paul initially joined Playboy, he had worked on an hourly basis as Hefner shuttled photos and artwork between his kitchen and Paul's small studio. The artist received only partial payment, but as the magazine flourished, he agreed to join Playboy as full-time art director and took part of his back payment in stock. He quickly began to create the cool, sophisticated, slightly irreverent graphics that became a hallmark of the magazine. Paul had been born and raised in Chicago and was trained at both the Art Institute and the Institute of Design. A freelance designer in his early career, he maintained a strong interest in jazz, classical music, and films. Upon his joining Playboy, he and Hefner talked extensively about design, communication, and how to say what you wanted to say. They collaborated closely on early issues of the magazine, often working frantically with Paul doing layout and Hefner writing copy right up to press time. The art director, like Hefner, was determined to create a distinctive look for the magazine. In his words, "I really wanted to see if I couldn't create a whole new visual kind of language." He sought a clean, fresh design style with, in his phrase, a keen sense of drama. Paul had a hand in shaping every visual component of Playboy, choosing artwork and arranging photographs, directing layout and type styles, consulting on cartoon art and reproductions, and conceptualizing special features. He played a key role in designing the magazine's cover, which not only had to convey what the issue was about, but also include the Playboy rabbit symbol. The latter quickly developed into a game as readers tried to find the often cleverly hidden head and ears logo. But whatever the specific project, Paul always aimed for a strong relationship between language and graphics. He believed that visuals must somehow broaden the scope of the story or get the reader to exercise curiosity. While Paul worked with Hefner to shape the distinct graphic image of Playboy, Ray Russell arrived to help with a host of editorial chores. He had also grown up in Chicago, studying acting at the Goodman Theater and music at the Chicago Conservatory of Music before serving a stint in the Air Force during World War II. He was working as an editor at the Walgreen Pepper Pod, the house publication of Walgreen drugstores, when he saw the first issue of Playboy in a local bookstore. Noticing the reprinted articles obviously secured on the cheap, he sent off a couple of his stories to the magazine, along with a humorous note recommending that it wise up and start printing a few stories written later than 1889. To Russell's surprise, he received a phone call a couple of days later from a young man, obviously pitching his voice very low in an attempt to sound 50 years old. They set up a meeting at a bar in January 1954, Russell hoping to secure a writing assignment or two, but Hefner, who arrived carrying his usual oversized briefcase full of artwork and layouts, was so impressed that he offered the writer an editorial position on the spot. Russell accepted immediately. He joined Hefner and Paul at the Superior Street offices a couple of weeks later. "The three of us constituted the entire editorial and art staff of Playboy. There weren't even any secretaries. Hef and I typed our own letters," Russell related. Hef and Art and I were constantly in and out of each other's offices, conferring, very occasionally arguing, bubbling over with ideas and enthusiasm. Russell became involved with every aspect of the magazine dealing with words. He screened submissions, edited those chosen for publication, wrote photo captions and subscription pitches, reviewed books and movies, and retold ribald classics from Boccaccio and Balzac. He even wrote original articles on current personalities such as Frank Lloyd Wright and Dave Garroway. One of his most enduring contributions was the subscription pitch titled, "What is a Playboy?" that became a key expression of the magazine's philosophy for many years. Looking like a miniature Orson Welles with his rotund figure, beard, cigar, and theatrical personality, Russell threw himself into the multitude of tasks facing the tiny staff. When boxes of new magazines from the bindery arrived, he helped Hefner lug them up the stairs and weigh them on a baby scale. It was Hefner's own, donated by his mother, before they were sent out to distributors. He emptied the wastebaskets. He scrambled to meet publication deadlines as he, Hefner, and Paul often drove to the printing plant in Rochelle once a month and stayed up all night amid the roar of machinery, correcting proof pages as they rolled off the presses still wet. But Russell loved his work. The early magazine was crude but vital, full of amateurish blunders but also full of freshness and wide-eyed enthusiasm, he noted. Hefner's third important hire was Vince Tajiri, who became photo editor. Of Japanese-American background and a native of Southern California, this self-taught photographer had served during World War II with the famous 442nd Infantry before moving to Chicago to shoot weddings and assignments for small magazines. He was employed at Publishers Development Corporation when he befriended Hefner. He declined to invest in Playboy because of the risk, but responded to Hefner's job offer a couple of years later. When I arrived, the photo department was me, one file cabinet, a secretary, and 2 desks, he recalled. Tajiri also wondered aloud if there would be enough work to keep him busy. Hefner let him forget the remark, but soon began to focus on creating a distinct photographic style for Playboy. He described it as slick but candid, a cross between advertising photography and photojournalism, not only for the nude layouts but for fashion, food and drink, all the lifestyle elements that are such an integral part of the magazine's identity. Something of a perfectionist, Tajiri took great pains to choose just the right photos from among the hundreds he took or were submitted to him. Photographers sometimes went through 8 or 10 shoots before Tajiri would accept their work. "We always overshoot our layouts," he explained. "For example, we usually shoot about 120 sheets for each playmate. We only use about 1 out of every 50 shots." Tajiri also proved very sensitive to Hefner's aesthetic preferences, especially regarding young women. In his words, the publisher liked a natural feeling where the girl was caught in a moment of her life when she was doing something, or has just done something, and then looks up at the camera and presumably associates with the reader. This approach also carried over into photographs of clothing and meals, where Tajiri proved adept at conveying the fun you could have or enjoy, the tastes of foods, the taste of wines. His photographic style became a hallmark of Playboy. It is rather slick, but we try to bring into it a candid, alive, realistic feeling, he explained. In 1956, a second stage of staff expansion came as Playboy profits funded the move to a 4-story office building on Ohio Street. As Hefner wrote to his brother in April, "On the business side, everything I have to report is tremendous. Each month proves incredibly better than the last, and this obviously cannot go on forever, but the end of the growth is not yet in sight." This continued success of the magazine allowed for a payment of an annual lease of about $500,000, following a complete remodeling of the building at a cost of about $325,000. It also allowed Hefner to hire several important figures who would play major roles in taking Playboy to a new level of popularity and influence. His most important move came with the hiring of A.C. Spektorsky. In July 1956, Playboy announced that this distinguished New York journalist and literary figure would be joining the magazine as Hefner's second-in-command. The publisher had decided that someone carrying credentials with the East Coast establishment would help Playboy to gain increased respectability. Playboy had published one of Spektorsky's stories, Some Guys Get It, under a pseudonym, and when Hefner decided to hire a literary editor, his name surfaced. The young publisher set about luring Spektorsky to Chicago. After a phone call established that he might be interested, Hefner flew to New York to discuss the situation and offered the job. After a trip to Chicago to check out the Playboy operation, Spektorsky accepted. Arrangements were soon made. A salary of $35,000 a year, an expense account, stock options, moving expenses, an advance against salary to escape one apartment lease and sign another. Hefner was delighted with his new editorial director. Impressed with Spektorsky's literary credentials and connections to writers, he described the New Yorker as a real heavyweight who would handle a lot of the issue-by-issue problems and free me to plan more of the special features, handle long-range planning, etc. Spektorsky appeared equally pleased with his new job. Convinced that his talents and Hefner's would complement one another perfectly, he told the publisher, "With your instincts and my taste, there's nothing we can't accomplish." Equally important, he was content to remain in the background and support Hefner as the public symbol of the magazine. "I think Hef, the young spark plug and head of the whole operation, is the guy who should be kept in the foreground," he wrote in a staff memo. August Comte Spektorsky did much to bring a more sophisticated, polished air to the upstart Chicago publication.